Hello, everyone out there, and thank you for joining the McMaster Museum of Art online to celebrate Culture Days 2020, a national celebration of arts and culture. The theme this year is Connecting Community, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you artist Hiba Abdallah.
Hi.
Hiba, welcome. Today we'll talk about your provocative and poignant text-based works that engage both specific neighborhoods and the cities you work in. In particular, your growing relationship to the city of Hamilton through recent presentations at Supercrawl, Centre 3, and now the McMaster Museum of Art. So before we begin our conversation, I'll introduce you a little bit more formally. Hiba, your projects are embedded in social practice and often use text as a way of exploring topics of locality and civic agency. You received your BFA from the University of Windsor in 2012 and your MFA from the University of Guelph in 2017. Your work at last year's Hamilton Supercrawl, in retrospect, was presented in association with the McMaster Museum of Art in support of public art initiatives at McMaster University and throughout the city of Hamilton. Today, the McMaster Museum of Art is very pleased to announce the opening of your work, We Remain Profoundly and Infinitely Connected, installed on the museum's facade and part of the museum's permanent collection. I'd like to take the opportunity right now to acknowledge that McMaster University sits on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. So about this work, just to introduce it briefly, you'll talk more about it, I'm sure. But you've said that the McMaster Museum of Art is a beacon of engagement and learning, both on campus and with the public at large. When thinking about the role this institution holds in the community, I wanted to create a statement that emphasizes human connectivity as a reciprocal feedback loop. The text, created in white neon on a matte gray background, is simple yet evocative of the complex nature of connection, as evidenced in the very subjects studied on campus, from quantum physics to political science to visual art and biochemistry. My hope is for this piece to function as a welcoming prompt when entering the museum during the day and a poetic declaration of unity at night. Amazing. So Hiba, welcome, and thank you for joining me for this virtual conversation in celebration of Culture Days and to launch your work at the McMaster Museum of Art. It's very exciting.
Yeah, I'm so excited. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So I'll jump right in. Question number one, to begin, would you please tell me more about your practice and working in and with communities?
Sure. So I've been working now just a little bit over a decade in this realm that in the art world we kind of call social engagement. And so what that means is that a lot of my projects are based around collaborations with others, and sometimes that's other artists or other creative practitioners, but a lot of times it's other community members in different communities across Canada and North America. So what that means is that usually the project will then be led by the people that I'm working with, and the issues or the stories or the ideas or subjects that they think are most important for me to focus on or to think about as an artist. So it's a very kind of like back and forth give and take relationship, which again kind of relates to what you just said in introducing the new piece that I did at McMaster as this, like this feedback loop. So I kind of see social engagement as this constant feedback loop of I give a little, you give me something, and we kind of are going back and forth almost like a tennis match until we land on something collectively. That usually takes the form of, you know, in the case of my practice, a text-based work. So that could be a book, that could be a big kind of public installation like what we saw at the Supercrawl. It can be a series of like community dinners. It really depends on the shape that we collectively decide on. And so I've been working in this way, like I said, for the last 10 years. And I started in Windsor with a collective called Broken City Lab. And we were really working to try and understand the intersections of where like art and civic responsibility intersect. And so that was kind of my starting point. And now I'm based in Toronto and continuing to work in various communities.
So your relationship with Hamilton did begin actually in 2012, like you say, as part of the Broken City Lab Collective's exhibition, Two Tales of a City at the Hamilton Artists Inc. So can you tell me about this and this subsequent work that you've done in Hamilton and that weaving in and out of this city, which you feel is so much like the city you're from, Windsor?
Yeah, so like you said, my relationship with Hamilton started a long time ago, and it's always quite interesting to travel to other cities to do work. You feel, of course, like a guest. It's very different than for me, making work in Windsor, which is where I grew up. So I feel like I almost have a little bit more like agency, or I know the kind of like fabric of the city more intimately. So I feel like I have ownership over it in a different way. So it was interesting when I first came to Hamilton, I immediately drew so many similarities, but of course Hamilton also has like so many unique characteristics as well. But the biggest thing that stood out was that they're both like post-industrial cities, right? So it was interesting to kind of dive in and do some research around how Hamilton's narrative and story is shaped around like steel industry, but also its really, really strong textile industry. And so Two Tales of a City was a way of actually bringing forth the history of the textile industry in Hamilton, which seems to always be in the shadow of steel, even though it's still such a rich part of Hamilton. And so essentially we, spent, I think, at least 2 months researching and making trips back and forth between Windsor and Hamilton to try and understand this history better. And then at the Hamilton Artists Inc., we made like a textile text piece on the side of the building that was, the messages were changing every single week to reflect that history. And so I think from that point on, I was just still so fascinated by Hamilton, fascinated to its proximity of Toronto and how that affects its relationship. And so at any opportunity I got to come back to Hamilton to do something, whether it was a workshop or another project, I always said yes, because there's something that's very special about the city and also very complex that I find myself really drawn to.
So question number 3, which I have to ask because it's very timely. So your work is about language and captures both the simplicity and complexity of how we all relate in the world. During this COVID-19 pandemic, what do you think the response to your work has been now that it's ever so poignant?
Yeah, so that's been really kind of fascinating for me to experience, because that's sort of why I'm so drawn to language. It's so pointed, but it can also be so vague and poetic. And I think that that's also the beauty, but also the danger of language. The words that we use are very important. It's how we communicate as a species. It's, and of course there's the complexity of languages that we can also get into. So like, there's all these different like matrices of how languages intersect, but also how a word can mean something now and then mean something different tomorrow. And I've always been interested in that idea of like how language shifts throughout time. So the perfect example being now that we're in COVID, and this billboard that I did for the Supercrawl, that's been up since like way before COVID. Mm-hmm. But of course, its context has shifted now that our social context has shifted. And so it's been really fascinating, getting messages from people who see it in Hamilton and they reach out to me and they're like, how did you know? Or like, and I'm like, well, this message to me was still relevant back in like September 2019 when it went up, but now its context just means something different because of this moment. And like, maybe a year from now, if someone looks back on the images of it, they'll think it means something completely different. And I really like that flexibility of language. And I feel similarly about this new commission at the McMaster Museum of Art, because this started last year, but of course it's launching now. And so again, its context has shifted, right? But I think that that's just kind of the beauty of it and also the challenge of it. So yeah.
For sure, yeah. I was going to ask you another sort of off-scripted question that I just thought of now. As we move towards the future, do you see any changes in your work that might happen because of this pandemic?
I mean, it's definitely changed the way that I get to work with people, right? So it's really presented a challenge for socially engaged artists, community engaged artists, because our work is based off of that. And so finding different ways to connect with people, you know, we're talking over Zoom right now, but in a lot of different scenarios, that's not like possible, you know? So there's also like that kind of challenge to overcome. So of course, I'm sure it already has changed the way that I have to make work, because we're just not able to be in the same space. But it's also created this really interesting arena or space to think about connectivity and how and what like human resiliency looks like, the way that we're able to adapt to really difficult and challenging times, but stay connected, you know, and I don't mean just like through the internet, I mean like emotional connectivity. So that's been really interesting to you know, think about and reflect on, but also experience throughout this pandemic, and I'm sure will have lasting effects. And of course, this affects all artists. It's not inclusive to me in any way, but
Sure.
I just think because I work so closely with people, it's definitely posed a different kind of set of challenges.
Yeah, for sure. So thank you, Hiba, and we'll be in touch soon. And thank you for giving us such a beautiful work of art at the museum, especially
Oh,
now when we can't be open. It gives people something to look at without
yeah.
having to go in the building.
Thank you so much, and I'm so grateful and happy I got to work with the museum. It's been such a fantastic opportunity and time spent working with the museum and coming up with this work, so thank you.